Hey there, so I got another deck guide for you. This time we're going to be talking about Kylo Ren. This is a green version of it. It's been pretty fun. This is still pretty early on in kind of the deck building process. I've just been enjoying this deck a lot, so I thought I'd make a short video about it. It's not going to be as fleshed out as some other ones just because of how early in testing it is. But it's been great. It's cool. It's different than a lot of other decks, and it's certainly not an aggro deck, which is what I think a lot of Kylos tend to gravitate towards just because of how that leader in general works. But why am I playing Kylo Green? So basically, the main feature here is Palpatine's return. I'm not the first person to identify this combo with Kylo, right? You get a free discard with his leader ability, so you can throw any of the big force units like Vader, Maul, or Palpatine into your discard pile so that you can then Palpatine's return them for 6 resources. It's the cleanest way to kind of turn Palpatine's return on. Usually it's a card that's used in attrition games later in the game to bring back things that have already died. But Kylo's definitely the easiest way to get something into your discard pile early in the game so that you can then cheat it out. Additionally, Kylo is also a very cheap force unit. Is the cheapest force enabler for as far as leaders are concerned in the game. He's more fragile than some other leaders, but of course, having him out early means that you get to turn on Force Throw reliably. Force Choke gets its nice discount. If you're going to play something like Force Lightning, which I have in the sideboard right now, that as well gets turned on by Kylo's Force trait. So those are kind of the two things. Palpatine's return is obviously number one. That is what I'm trying to build around. The deck kind of revolves around that. This is not an aggro deck. It's a mid-range ramp deck, as are similar in the vein that most red-green villain decks are. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit too as kind of a general archetype discussion. So red-green villain hasn't had tons of success currently in the meta. I do think Boss Green is quite a powerful deck. It certainly shows up now and again. It is very powerful. These decks with Vader and Palpatine, they all do have similarities around them, that they're playing, the villain ramp shell, generally overwhelming barrage. They'll typically play bigger units like Vader or Maul. Some of these decks, like Boss, typically, at least the more successful ones so far, have tend to trend a little lower to the ground, so they're usually not ramping much past 7 or 8, whereas the Vader and Palpatine decks typically want to go even bigger. Kylo would probably be more similar to the Boss shell. I'm not trying to outgrind a Vader. It's more built to capitalize on his earlier power, right? So when you compare Kylo, to all these other ones, what is Kylo doing differently? So Kylo, like we said, he's a force user that comes out early, so that's a benefit. Him coming out early in general is a benefit to this archetype that, especially when you're talking about Vader and Palp, struggles mightily into aggro, basically having non-factor leaders in those matchups. So Kylo, being the cheapest of the options in this archetype, certainly gives him a little bit of a edge there, right? You can just you match Sabine's deploy with Kylo, so you're able to fight a little better on the ground. Force Throw, of course, is also very powerful in that matchup, giving you a one cost ability to potentially one shot a Sabine or something. Cool thing about Force Throw, by the way, also is you can pitch your Palpatine or something and then Palps return it, right? So you don't even have to rely on Kylo's self discard ability. Bosk, on the other hand, I think is probably the most well-rounded of these bunches. He also does much better into aggro, dare I say, even potentially favored into Sabine, just because of his body being huge, and he gets to be a very good overwhelming barrage target early in the game. With the ramp, he also gets to just match the Sabine deploy, often being able to hold her hostage because of Overwhelming Barrage and things like Force Choke. The bounties themselves are also like Bounty Hunter's Quarry is also very powerful there for him because he's able to cheat out bigger units that then brawl on the ground better. Bosk, though, his issue tends to be that he sometimes has the wrong half of the deck problem, more so than most decks, because he has to run this very linear bounty package, which, you know, you get into grindy situations late in the game and you draw a Dengar and a price on your head and you're less happy, right? Now, any deck can clunk out. Bosk's clunk out factor is probably just a little higher because of the like magnitude of the weird cards that he has to run. And then Vader and Palp is pretty similar in terms of like what they're trying to do, going bigger, right? These leaders are massive. They are very powerful. It gives these decks more late game power, but they sacrifice tremendously in the early game. We are not seeing Vader basically anywhere right now when it comes to like top meta games. Palpatine as well. He had a couple weeks early where I was doing pretty well, but since then, not really making the cut. I do think there is a major problem, especially in red-green villain when you're talking about Vader and Palp. The matchup into Sabine is embarrassing, and because of that, and Sabine currently being the most played deck in the format, it does kind of push these decks out a little bit. Now, they can still be very powerful, and if you dodge Sabine a bunch, you're great, right? Okay, so I know this is a Kylo deck guide. I haven't really talked that much about the deck itself, but I did want to kind of break down the red-green villain archetype in terms of like what the differences are, right? So we're doing Kylo. Kylo is lower to the ground. He gives you a little bit more oomph into Sabine because of the early deploy and the force traits, and then he gives you this Palpatine's Return combo. So here's the deck. I know I'm covering the sideboard, but don't worry, that's going to be on a separate page. Let's talk about the cards. So I'm going to start with the 2-drops in the deck. There are 10 of them. 2 Viper Probes, 2 Seasoned Shore Troopers, 3 Gamorrean Retainers, and 3 Kylo TIE Silencer. I think in general, the 2-drop and the 3-drop slot in red-green villain is very bad. I do not think the cards are very good in general. You just kind of have to pick your favorites. Kylo's TIE is actually good, right? That card brawls in space really well. Now, we are not an aggro deck, but Kylo TIE is very good at fighting aggro starts from other space decks. So it's great. It gets the bonus that you can like throw it down with Kylo and pick it back up. It doesn't come up too often, but often enough. We're playing 5 3/2s on the ground. Gamorrean Retainers, I play them because they sometimes have Sentinel, especially later in the game when you have like Vaders and Mauls. Now, Vader doesn't pull it out, but if you incidentally got one into play. Other than that, it's a 3/2, right? That's also got 2 Viper Probes, which again, it's just the 3/2. We're just trying to like use our units early to trade. The 3/2s do that better than the 2 3s. I've opted for 2 Seasoned Shore Troopers here just because they can get pulled out of Vader and later in the game are a bit better. They are also the card I would much rather have into a Crafty Smuggler start because the Crafty Smuggler is very good into the 3/2s. Past that, none of these cards are that exciting. You could definitely switch some of these out. If you want to play Scanning Officer, for instance, you can certainly try to get that in there. Like I would just be cautious about cutting too many of the like cards that Vader would pull out, but of course, Vader, we mostly want him to pull the 3s in this deck, so as long as you just have a few Imperial 2s, I think you'll mostly be okay to mess around with those 2s. You can even maybe go down to 9 of them. I think that's, other than the 3 Kylo's TIE, I think that slot, that 2-drop slot is incredibly flexible. It's also incredibly weak, so, you know, you can mess around with that. The 3-drop units are going to be 3 Fifth Brother, 3 Phase, 3 Dark Troopers, 3 Super Laser Techs, 2 Black Suns. I'm playing a lot of the Sentinels, right? Because again, this is not an aggro deck. We just want to like get through that hiccup of the early game, which is really weak in these colors. Kylo helps shore that up a little bit just by being a deploy. We get the Force stuff to help kind of like bridge that mid game. We're using Energy Conversion Lab to hopefully flip the game, and like catch up in tempo before we start on the 6 resources, which is when we're turning on like Palp's Return and Ruthless Raider and going up the chain. So Sentinels help with that, and they're also just good to pull off of Vader. Super Laser Tech, I mean, that's just ramp. That's obvious. We are a ramp deck. We're playing 5 ramp with 2 resupply. I could see going up to 6. It's pretty reasonable. It's just that we're not going past 8, at least not in the main deck. So that's why I've stuck with 5. It's also just, we really only need to ramp once, because once we ramp once, we're on the 5-drop slot. The 5-drop slot has Overwhelming Barrage and IG, which we'll talk about in a second. And then from then on, we kind of just do want to play 6 to 7 to 8, right? So skipping twice isn't always that necessary. The 5th Brother here, I don't like 5th Brother very much. The reason it's here is because I'm playing Force Throw, and there are situations where you just like can't get a clean Kylo flip. Just having a second early thing to have Force Trade on to turn on your Force Throw is kind of necessary sometimes. Of course, late in the game, all our big units have Force, so Force Throw is a pretty good top deck later. But just having like another chance to enable it early in the game is pretty decent, so that's why 5th Brother is here. So resupply I mentioned. I'll talk about Force Throw and Force Choke, so both fantastic cards. Force Throw, don't be afraid to use it on yourself if you have a Force unit, especially if you want to just chuck one of your big things for Palpatine's return. But, you know, in a lot of matchups, the card advantage stuff isn't going to matter that much. So 2 for 1ing yourself to kill a vital thing like a Sabine or a Boba Leader or something can be really powerful. Also, when you have Kylo in play, if you Force Throw yourself, you do buff his power by an extra. So you do need to keep track of kind of the math, because he is often flipping as a 1 power or 2 power unit in this deck. We are not discarding our hand, right? So if I don't have Force Throw to like chuck a Palpatine or a Vader or Maul, I will often, especially when I have Palp's Return in my hand, I'm just going to use Kylo's ability to throw a card away. Just get that unit into your discard pile. Ideally do that when you were already not going to have initiative going into the next turn. For instance, your opponent already claimed. That's a good time to just like, all right, let's just get this set up. Chuck the Palpatine to the discard pile. Don't even have anything to buff. Who cares? And then move on. So that's giving yourself up card advantage, but the idea is that's going to catch up mightily when you bring that unit back early. But the other thing, of course, is Force Throw. So you can rely on that instead of Kylo's ability. Speaking of Kylo's ability, we'll get into that a little more later. The 5 drops, Overwhelming Barrage and IG. So IG is awesome. He is one of the best catch-up mechanics for this deck because he often can 2 for 1. Because our earlier game units don't always trade very well. So there's going to be a lot of times where your opponent just has a damaged unit out. IG is going to clean that up and kill something else. It's the perfect bridge to what we're doing after that. Overwhelming Barrage. It's Overwhelming Barrage. Early in the game, you can sometimes get like a decent 5 power barrage off of one of your Sentinels or off of Kylo. Keep in mind that you Overwhelming Barrage on Kylo, it's probably +3/+3, right? Because you're not going to, it's 1 less card in your hand. And that is something when I don't have IG that I look for to like flip Barrage off Kylo and then use Kylo to kill something. He'll usually just die, but that's okay. He's not meant to live very long in this deck. And then from then on, again, once we get to 6, that's the Palpatine return turn. That's also the Ruthless Raider turn. And from then on, we're just trying to play a Haymaker every turn. And Palpatine's return, I don't need to say much more about that. We talked about it endlessly. Ruthless Raider is one of the best cards into control right now. It's a very annoying card for control decks to deal with because of its stat line and because of its guaranteed damage. We really like Ruthless Raider. It's a big reason to be in Villain Red right now. It's like one of the few main draws for me to be in Villain Red is Ruthless Raider. So definitely playing that. It's also a good Palpatine's return target, even though you're not cheating resources, right? Especially against control decks where, you know, you're expecting your things to get removed. So, you know, every time you Palp return a Ruthless Raider, it's between 4 and 8 damage to their base, depending on if you can get an attack off. All right, the Highmakers. We're playing 9, right? We're playing 3 Vaders, 3 Mauls, 3 Palpatines. It's very clean. We just kind of want to go up the chain every game. Once we get there, we want to play one of these guys every turn. It's why we play so many of them. They all do it a little differently. Vader's kind of usually the best one to do earlier, especially when you're cheating him out, just because he'll usually clean something very cleanly and then add to your board. And from there, like now your opponent has to play a little catch up, and that's when like something like Palpatine coming down can really clean up. Of course, Palpatine for 6 can also really clean up, especially if your opponent started to swarm. And Maul is your best like direct finisher. That overall damage really adds up. All these guys, they come down, they die, they come back because you have so many of them, and you have Palp's return to bring them back. You just trying to do this over and over and over again. They all also turn on force throw. They all discount force choke. So there are sequences where you're able to like play 2 cards, even though you've played a 7 or an 8 drop and you only have 1 resource left. All right, the discard mechanic. So I touched on this a bit. Basically, I'm only using this once, his leader side ability, unless buffing a unit is very important, either to like push damage to close a game or to enable an overwhelming barrage. But basically, we're just trying to chuck if we have Palpatine's return, we're trying to chuck a force unit into the discard pile so that we can get it out on 6. That's great, and you want to do this without throwing away initiative, generally speaking. Barrage, you know, there are situations, especially earlier in the game, that you can buff a unit and then barrage off of that same unit to get like a really clean board wipe. So look out for opportunities to do that. Additionally, you know, his flip isn't going to be very strong. I'm not trying to discard cards often with his ability, so sometimes if you absolutely need him to be able to flip and kill something, you might need to just toss a card just so he has an extra power to do that. But generally, we are not throwing cards away very much. We're just trying to enable the Palp's return with his ability and get sometimes incidental damage. As for his deploy, it's incredibly weak. It's probably the weakest part, like the weakest part of this deck is probably just having to play this leader. We're almost playing leaderless a lot of the time, like especially against interactive decks. Like he comes out, he's like a 2/4. He like attacks once and dies. It's like not, but he usually forces your opponent to like answer him, right? And that lets you bridge a turn, generally speaking. But for the most part, it's not very strong. But his flip does help early in the game just to like help stabilize a little bit, right? We're trying to get through those like 3, 4, 5 resource turns without either like instantly losing to Sabine, where he helps because he can brawl, or without falling so far behind like tempo against Boba, where we can't catch up with our haymakers. But basically, his deploy is very weak. It's there to like kill one unit and then die, or like flip and force throw, right? Force choke, catch up that way. All right, energy conversion lab. So we run it. We run it because we do tend to fall behind a bit early in the game, because red green villain always falls behind early in the game. Doesn't have very many good early units. The best catch-up mechanic I've identified is IG-11. I think him being able to 2-for-1 and usually stay behind means that he can often be a 3-for-1 in value off of an ambush. He also one-shots basically every leader you would want in the early game except for Boba. But of course, if Boba has taken any damage, he can then one-shot Boba, or potentially kill Boba and kill something else. So that's pretty good. Ruthless Raider being able to energy conversion lab and kill Fett's Fire Spray is pretty powerful. There's a few other niche ones, like your 3/2 ships being able to ambush into an A-wing and kill it. Your Phase 3 Dark Trooper being able to ambush into 2 power units and getting buffed and leaving behind a bigger Sentinel. Sometimes has some utility. And there are some other options to include. I'll talk about them at the end of the video. So this is so far like all I have, but I think something like Rook or Kylo Ren unit would both be also very plausible solutions here. All right, chaining payoffs. Mostly talked about this, right? Once we get to like 6 resources, we basically want to just be deploying Vader, Maul, and Emperor Palpatine endlessly. We have 9 copies of them plus the 3 Palps returns. It's basically 12 copies of these cards. It's really hard for your opponent eventually to just like answer all of this, even if they're going bigger than you, just because you have so many of them. Yeah, that's the idea. And Ruthless Raider is kind of there as well to be a solution when we don't draw Palpatine's return, or a solution when we've already pushed some damage and it is kind of our reach. All right, my current sideboard, still obviously a work in progress. This whole deck is a work in progress, but Force Lightning is, I'm a little intrigued by that in some situations. I think because we have so many Force units, and especially like our leader and our fifth brother, but also we are bringing out these big ones early. Force Lightning is going to be more reliably turned on late in the game. Obviously, it means that that's something that can kill big units, fire sprays, Avengers, leaders, right? So I think there are some situations where Force Lightning would be nice, but I also find some cool spots to do with things to do with it early, like being able to zap a super laser tech so it loses its ability. That can be pretty devastating for decks that are very much relying on going from 3 to 5. You can zap Akira, which makes her lose her grit, so she would just be an 0-4. So if you can do that and then kill her with something, that's pretty cool. You know, it can get rid of Sentinels even without a Force unit, right? Like a lot of these things, like the Kira, the Super Laser Tech, Sentinels, like you can remove those abilities even without a Force unit in play. But you do often have Force units. Star Viper is a little more insurance into Sabine. It's a good ambush unit. It kills like their red 3s, their A-wings, their Alliance X-wings, and then leaves behind a restoring unit. We don't actually have any other heal, so it's a nice thing to have. Rook, talked about it a little while ago. It's a very good energy conversion lab target. It's good into some specific decks. I think it's quite good into like Blue Han, where they play like chunky units like Kanans and Obi-Wans and Lukes, and being able to one-shot those. And it also dodges blue removal very well, being a 3/6, so it doesn't get hit by takedown or fell to dragon. It also is a clean answer to a crate dragon. Now, usually we don't have energy conversion lab up that late, but if you do, it does take care of that problem. For surrender into control, I'm choosing that over pillage because I don't think we can really dig in so much into the discard plan. But Force Surrender does the attrition plan really well because it's a 4-for-1, right? We draw 2, they discard 2. That's a pretty massive swing of card advantage. Whereas Pillage is just a 2-for-1 that puts us behind on tempo. Force Surrender is a 4-for-1 that puts us behind on tempo. So it's more for that card advantage. It works nicely with Ruthless Raider because if you have a Raider out, you're hitting them for 4, or they're killing it so that they don't take the 4, but then Ruthless Raider immediately turns on that Force Surrender, which is pretty nice. And lastly, 2 Crate Dragons. Opted here instead of like Relentless and Devastator for the Crate because I think to beat really long control decks, our plan will be more for like chip damage through like our big Force units and hopefully getting like 1 or 2 clean attacks and Ruthless Raider chains. So I think in that scenario, just having Crate Dragon to be more like chip damage, right? For them to remove them, they still almost always have to take damage. So because of that, opted there instead of like Relentless, which would also definitely be a consideration. Devastator as well. All right, some other options that I'm looking at. So Scanning Officer to replace some of the other 2s. Especially if you see a lot of tech, I think you may want to jam him in there. Open Fire is a pretty decent card. It's nothing special, but against specifically aggro decks, and I think also against like the Han 2 decks that try to cheat out units, even there it's like quite good because it means that they want to cheat out something like a Poe or a Wrecker. It's in Open Fire range now, so it's cool. Imperial Interceptor is some more space support. I think I like the current space enough to not need it because we've got like Kylo's Tie and Black Sun and then Ruthless Raider and of course Consortium Star Vipers if you want more. Pillage, talked about it. You can opt for an even heavier discard package since we do play Force Throw, so you can try like Pillage and Force Surrender and really go hard against your opponent's hand with that. I think that's an option. Kylo Ren, he's a pretty good energy conversion lab target. Him being able to come in and ambush for 8 is quite impactful. The issue I found with him is just at 6, we already have 3 Ruthless Raiders and 3 Palps returns. I kind of want to ambush the turn before to help stabilize the board and then start chaining the big stuff. Using Kylo to kind of catch up on board by having him like take out a leader isn't as exciting for me. Also, he's a Force unit, but it doesn't get discounted by Palps return since he already costs 6. Reinforcement Walker, another really good top end. Just, I think, very versatile card. Definitely worthy of consideration. Assault Cruiser. I keep looking at this card and like wanting to play it, but you know, most of the time the issue is that if your opponent doesn't have a space unit, then it's just really anemic. It's not super reliable. So I've not yet found good spots to get it in there. It also, like, unfortunately isn't big enough to kill things like Avenger and Relentless because it's a 7/8, which definitely knocks it down a peg. And then you've got the big capital ships, Relentless and Devastator. These are certainly options. They're options for your main deck. They're options for the sideboard. If you're gonna go this big, I'd probably play the 3rd resupply in the main deck also, and try to figure out other things to cut, because at that point you really are just a hard ramp deck. But I've had decent success just like not over committing to large units and just trying to like aggro out once we start chaining the Force units. All right, so that's really a wrap. This is still like an early version of this deck. I've been playing it for some time now, but got it to a point where I felt like it's pretty competitive. I'm not going to go out and claim it's the best deck or anything. There's definitely room for this to improve. There's definitely some weaknesses, right? It is a little bit of a combo-y deck, right? And if you draw the wrong pieces sometimes, it can feel really anemic. You're also playing a deck that is kind of leaderless, right? The Kylo leader is incredibly weak in this deck. He is there purely as like a combo enabler and a Force enabler. And we hope to get a few extra points into hard aggro because we can match their deploy with an early leader. All right. That is it. Hope you made it here. Please take a moment, like the video, subscribe, check out my Patreon if you haven't. I got some deck lists there, including this one that's been featured there for a few weeks now, before I decided to make a video about it. So that is all. Until next time, take care.